Welcome to my YouTube channel, Radiant Reviews. I am Michael, I live in the Netherlands and I have a background in animation. Lately I noticed that many people, myself included, complain that there is a lack of solid comic book reviews. So I am interested in providing that. My approach for this is somewhat scholarly, meaning that the reviews I do are a way of studying the art form of comics. Personally, I believe comics ought to be enjoyed, but should also be interesting. And with that I mean that comics tell us something relevant about the human condition, our hopes, fears and desires. So, does the comic relate to the human condition of our day and age in an interesting way, and is the form in which it's doing that something that is fresh and maybe innovative? I love comics, but I will try to be objective. I do not own a comic book store, so I am not in the business of selling the comics that I review. For this project I will be reviewing Marvel's new superhero comic books that came out on Marvel Unlimited this week. So comics that in fact are now 2 months old. Afterwards I might try a different angle or perhaps review other publishers as well. We'll see. My comic book collection consists predominantly of Marvel books, but certainly not exclusively. And never have I tried reading all Marvel's comics books that came out during the week before, so I am curious in what I will find, and if I will notice trends that I have not noticed before. My criteria that I will use are related to the cover design, the narrative, so the underlying idea, the text, the illustration, so the visual style, a visual storytelling, so the combination of both the narrative and the illustration into something that flows and keeps us engaged. The consistency of the creative team. I think when we look at the history of successful runs, we often find that creative teams are consistent. So I would argue that this is an important factor. And is the issue understandable on its own? Does it trigger my curiosity? So am I looking forward to the next issue? Which I think are both important factors for a periodical art form. And is there a sense of innovation apparent? Today we will look at the comics that came out this week, but in fact are from the 11th of May. So for this week, I think it's a relatively light week. We have 6 books on display that I will be reviewing, and in the end I will try to point out what in my opinion is my pick of the week. So for this week I will start with X-Men issue 11. X-Men issue 11 is written by Gerry Duggan. Pencils and inks are by Pepe Larraz. Colors by Marty Garcia and letters by Clayton Cowles. Some background information. In all honesty, I dropped this title after a few issues, so I am kind of familiar with the title. I think it's. I was one of the people who were somewhat disappointed to hear that Jonathan Hickman left the X-Men titles, and were left wondering, okay, where does this all this promise and this excitement and this curiosity that we had back again in the X titles, where will it go? And I felt a little bit disappointed when this was presented as the flagship title, let's say. So the story is something that reminds me a little bit of an old school X-Men issue written by Chris Claremont after the Inferno event, where we have the X-Men woman going out, and they end up somewhere in Game World, which and some kind of intergalactic adventure, something. I find it very difficult to really remember what was going on, even though I've read the issue quite recently. So For starters, I think the cover art looks really nice. The illustrations by Pepe Larraz are fantastic. This is a really, really exciting artist. I think it's a little bit sad that he's now picked up by Mark Millar, I believe. Also, I think the quality, the visual quality, is not only the result of the drawings by Pepe Larraz, but also the fantastic coloring by Marty Garcia. I think all in all, the visual storytelling, the pages are really appealing. So it really looks like one of the best books on the stand. I think the narrative is okay. It was, of course, it's an X-Men title, so it's a little bit difficult to get into, even though I do think that the writer Jerry Dugan tried to make it a little bit simpler, also by working with a recognizable team. I was not really that invested by the narrative itself. The stakes and all were something that I had the feeling I have read before, and it was for me the X-Men the X titles has lost some of its momentum when Jonathan Hickman has left, and now it becomes a little bit difficult on what does this have to say, what does it add to the X mythos, so to speak. So there I'm a little bit less convinced in terms of narrative. I think when you look at the consistency of the issues so far, I think that's quite solid. I think many things, many credits go here to the coloring by Marty Garcia. So there was also at some point during some prior issues, there was another artist involved. But in all honesty, this was hardly noticeable because it had a similar art style, but also because the art was so so much resting on the quality of the coloring, which played a huge part in the appreciation. I think it's the understandability of the story is okay for an X-Men title. I've lost the sense of curiosity and this sense of innovation that you had at the beginning when Jonathan Hickman came on board. That has gone. Like, you had to feel, okay, when Jonathan Hickman started out again with the House of X and Powers of X, you were really on the edge of your seat. Like, wow, what is happening? This is completely turning things around. New ideas, also trying out new forums and the data pages. I think these are still there, but the underlying idea, like where it's coming from, so it's not merely something that is cosmetic, then I think is not really there anymore. So moving on to the next book, that's Moon Knight Black and White #1. It's an anthology book that consists of 3 stories. One is Jonathan Hickman and Chris Bachalla, who tell a story about a different Moon Knight of the future. There is Mureva Ayodele and Dotun Akande, who have a Moon Knight story that partners up with Spider-Man. And there is a final story by Mark Guggenheim and Jorge Fornes. In all honesty, I have to admit that I am not the expert on Moon Knight. I'm not really that familiar with the character. I'm also not completely unfamiliar with the character, but I've never read the Bill Sienkiewicz or the David Finch runs. I've seen the MCU series, and I really enjoyed the series from a few years ago that was written by Jeff Lemire and illustrated by Greg Smallwood. I think that's a fantastic, underappreciated comic book. So here we have 3 short stories. There is a great cover design by Bill Sienkiewicz, and the three stories are somewhat inconsistent, let's say. I find the Jonathan Hickman story to be very confusing and very difficult to follow. Also really not helped by the artwork of Chris Bachalo. The Ayodele story is a little lightweight. Was not really no, I didn't really got into that. I do think the story by Guggenheim is interesting. It's a story that when you read it, you are wondering, okay, how is this structured? It seems like we are going backwards. So about halfway, you notice, okay, I am actually supposed to read this story backwards. So then you end up doing that, and then eventually it makes sense. I think that's an experiment with the form that is at least it's interesting. I think it's a little bit a pity that it doesn't work in two directions. So it can really be only read from the end to the back. I think that's a little bit of, it would have been great if it would work both ways. But it tries to do something new and interesting. I think in terms of illustration, I think Chris Bachalo and Jorge Fornes are great illustrators. And I do not think that Chris Bachalo is a great visual storyteller, in my opinion, or at least in this book. I have read other books by Chris Bachalo that were significantly better in terms of storytelling, but this was very confusing for me. But Jorge Fornes is a really solid visual storyteller. I do think in this book it's interesting that at the very least it appears to be used as a platform to try out different things, and there is some kind of innovation in the latest story. So that is a bit of a mixed bag, but and sort of you are expecting a lot from Jonathan Hickman and a very well-known artist, and then that doesn't really get rewarded to that extent, but at the very least at the end there is something there. Then we move on to the next one, and the next one is an alpha issue from the crossover of Hulk versus Thor, the Banner of Wars, part 1. So this is a crossover between two running series. Both are written by Donny Cates, and yes, it's a battle between the two characters. It's like playing with action figures and sort of a recording of playing with action figures. I think it's written by Donny Cates, pencils and inks by Martin Coccolo, the colors by Matthew Wilson, and the letters by Joe Sabino. In all honesty, I was at the time a few months ago. I was still reading both the Donny Cates stories, but this story for me was a drop-off point. I think it's hard. It's hardly connecting to the existing stories. Also, it's a little bit disappointing to see the artwork, but it was very thin. There is a lot of bombast and pomp and circumstance and promising that everything will be different at the end. It felt really as an idea of what you can do with storytelling, then have two characters fight. It seems to be that the underlying idea is sort of the childish fantasy. Okay, who would win in a battle, Thor or Hulk? And yeah, that's really a little. You expect a little bit more in terms of a dramatic development. I think the cover design by Gary Frank is very cool. The narrative on this story is very minimal and quite repetitive. So everything, the promise and the anticipate, it's all about that promise and anticipation, and then giving one blow and the other gives another blow, and the Hulk gives an even harder blow, and blah blah blah. I think that's really minimal in terms of a narrative. The illustration is not falls a little short when you would compare this to the regular artist of the Hulk, Ryan Ottley, or Ford, Nick Klein. So that's a little bit something that doesn't live up to that expectation. The coloring, though, really elevates the artistic world. So that is, it's still Matt Wilson, and he's still a fantastic color artist. The visual storytelling itself is clear and understandable, although it's also not really complex. The art is not really, when you talk about consistency, the art is not really consistent with the regular series. A good thing is that there is an introduction at the beginning of the book that really helps the reader up to speed of what happened before in both the series. The conflict is simplistic. I still also struggle with the core idea of the new Hulk series, which feels a little contrived, like a Hulk inside a Hulk. I don't know. Also, the reason for this crossover to exist, other than that the writer is doing both comic books, is unclear. So what is the dramatic necessity of this conflict is quite unclear to me. The curiosity is not really triggered by the premise of who would win in a fight between the Hulk and Thor. So I don't think it's a very original idea that is the core of this book. So for me, it was quite disappointing. We move on to the next title, which is Captain America: Symbol of Truth #1. So it's a new series. It's apparently there are now 2 Captain Americas, and one of them is Sam Wilson. So it's a new story. It's written by Tochi Onyebuchi, who has written Black Panther Legends and Riot Baby. And it's illustrated by R.B. Silva, who has worked on Powers of X, Inferno, and Fantastic Four. So, to what extent do I know this series? And I've not read Captain America for a while. Of course, I have read the run by Ed Brubaker. I have read the majority of the run by Mark Waid. I've read the first few issues by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Yes, and this new form, I missed some kind of an introduction how we got here. So I believe this is the second time that Sam Wilson is Captain America, but how this came to be, in all honesty, that is really not that clear to me. It's not completely unfamiliar. Also, when you are familiar with the MCU films, but in terms of the where this come from and how both Captain America titles relate to each other, maybe that becomes clear over time. I think the cover is nice. It's a bit static and unconnected to, let's say, a scene of the comic book. So it's very much a visual piece. The narrative is very solid. I think it's not groundbreaking, but it has interesting time jumps. There was a conclusion at the end of people meeting each other again that felt a little bit very coincidental and somewhat contrived. But overall, I could really, I stayed well connected throughout the story. I think the illustration by R.B. Silva is very appealing. It has a very bold blockbuster style. I'm not sure about the nature of this series as well. So if this is a mini series or if it's an ongoing series, if this is an ongoing series, I do wonder if R.B. Silva stays on board for longer than a few issues, because I mean visually it's really an A title, and I'm not sure if this book will be an A title for Marvel. I think the visual storytelling was well done. In terms of consistently, let's hope. So far, so good. It was understandable, although a little bit more background information would have been useful. As I've mentioned before, the comic does not seem to be breaking any new ground yet, although it does tackle some, let's say, political issues. And over time, I was thinking about this comic book also for who this comic would have been made. And I also thought about that a little bit harder and looking at the team as well and the people who are represented in this comic book. I think this is also, in a way, an effort to tell stories by and about underrepresented minorities, and I think that in itself is a very interesting new development in Marvel, which we will see also in many of the other books that I will be reviewing. So I think that in itself, I really hope that will be successful in that. So that's it for this book. We move on to the next book, which is a what if story by Miles Morales. It's sort of a what if that has a point of creating an amalgam character. So it's Miles Morales, who is the Spider-Man originally from the Ultimate Universe, and here he becomes the Incredible Hulk in some way. To what extent am I familiar with the story? Well, I have read quite a lot of the Miles Morales comic books. I've read all the Brian Michael Bendis stuff. I have read some of the later stuff, or a large part of the Saladin Ahmed series that is currently running. But in all honesty, that's not really needed for this book, because it's, I think, really unconnected to any current continuity. It's written by Anthony Piper. It's penciled and inked by Edgar Salazar. Colors are by Chris Sotomayor. Letters by Corey Petit. So the miniseries of Miles Amalgamon. When I look at the cover, it does communicate the content very effectively and also clear and simple. But in terms of design, it is not particularly out of the ordinary, nor does it exceed the quality of the interior art. So that is a bit strange, in all honesty. I feel. The narrative, I thought, was very well executed. The story is very easy to follow. As I've mentioned, I'm not completely sold on the underlying premise and of the what if Miles Morales became the Hulk out of continuity. Not sure if that's really that interesting, but still the story was really easy to stay on board with. The art style is very reminiscent of Gary Frank, I think, although I do assume that this artist is also very fast. The visual storytelling was very well done. All the story beats were well delivered, and there is a good flow of the story. So that is quite well done. The series seems to work with rotating creative teams. So this is, for this story, there is this art team, and for issue number 1 and issue number 2, there was another. The complaint that I might have with this is that nothing really seems to be at stake in terms of how this story relates to continuity, and the premise of amalgam characters is also not very original, so I'm not so sure if this will have any lasting effect. Maybe it's targeted at people looking for first appearances, but that seems to be a little bit trivial. So the underlying idea is not really that original or pushing the media in new direction. It appears to be, under my impression, I don't know because I'm not working at Marvel, to be somewhat of a books that allows Marvel to test out new talent, new artists, new writers. And I think that's interesting, that you also have these books where you can try out new people, new things. The last issue of this session is Shang-Chi number 12. So it's the last issue of the of the 12 issue arc. So it's a story about the hero Shang-Chi, who is in conflict with his grandfather about the rings and inheritance, so to speak. It's written by Jean Lewin Yang. Pencils are by Marcus To, inks as well. Colors by Eric Arciniega, and letters by Travis Lanham. In all honesty, I am not that familiar with the character. This is a final issue of a maxi series, so that is makes it a little bit difficult to make heads or tails about this comic book series. If I am being honest, I have seen the MCU film. In terms of the cover, there is a cover by Lionel Francis Yu, who I believe is a great artist, but sometimes his I wonder why he always gets asked for cover designs, because sometimes his compositions and angles tend to be a bit static or a little bit flat. The story itself also reminds me a little bit of Firepower, the Robert Kirkman series, or maybe Firepower has lent a lot from the original Shang-Chi, could also be possible, but it's when reading this, it's very difficult not to compare both. For me, as mentioned, this is the first issue that I've read, and it's the last issue of the series. So that makes it a little bit difficult to pick up on the character motivations and establish an emotional connection with the characters. The illustration is also difficult not to compare with Chris Samney, who is the illustrator at Firepower, who is of course a really excellent artist. So that is also something else. The coloring of this series is certainly not on par with that of Matt Wilson. Matt Wilson, the color artist of Firepower. The focus in terms of visual by the illustrator seems to be on storytelling, not so much on the illustrative or the stylistic qualities of the art itself. I think the visual story, as a result, is also quite very clear and dynamic and good to get into. In terms of consistency, I've looked back on who was involved before, and Marcus To is the artist now from issue number 9, and before it was Dyke Truon. It's particularly noticeable that most of the artists involved share an Asian heritage. So that seems to be a quite deliberate choice. I think the story itself of the comic book is very good to follow and understandable. I'm not completely sold yet. I do not really feel this is a very interesting original premise. But I do applaud that Marvel is giving space for artists with Asian cultural heritage to tell stories about heroes who share this background, and this seems a thread that permeates a lot of the things that Marvel has put out, at least for this week. When I look at Captain America, Miles Morales, and this title, this is very noticeable. I think that is, in that term, Marvel seems to be doing a very deliberate effort in terms of inclusivity, by not only showing people from different backgrounds, but also giving artists from different backgrounds the opportunities to do the work. And I'm very interested in what will come out of it. So now we are moving on to the last part of this review, which is the pick of the week. And in all honesty, I felt that was quite difficult, because maybe you have noticed there was not one title that I was completely enthusiastic about, and so for me, I think in the end, the best title of this week is the Captain America title. That seems to be the title that matters the most, that has the most promise of leading up to something important and relevant, and a solid back team involved. So that is my pick of this week. And that's it also for the reviews of this week. I hope you enjoyed. Please send your reactions in the comments. You can like this video. You can click the bell for notifications. And I'm looking really forward to reactions and learning about how you have experienced this set of reviews. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week with a new batch of reviews. Thank you. Bye now.